Hey guys, today we're going to talk about climate change, and I actually changed the order of the lectures a little bit up here. Um, Originally this was supposed to be the second lecture this week, but I think it's going to make more sense if we do it first, so that's what we're doing. And to understand how the Earth's climate has been changing during the last 2.5 million years, we need to look at astronomy. And first of all, climate parameters change from day to night. So the Earth revolves on an axis and it alternates between warming one side with solar radiation and then cooling it again at night. Similarly, we all know about how the Earth's orbit around the sun and its tilted axis generate annual climactic cycles because the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun during half of our orbit, so from March equinox to September or equinox, and the southern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun during the other half. So depending on which side is tilted towards the sun, you're going to have winter or summer or spring or fall. So it's what causes our seasons, right? And these two cycles, they generate kind of a pattern of climate variation that shapes how organisms act. So, for example, you'll have diurnal organisms or nocturnal organisms. You'll have organisms that react differently during different seasons. So maybe seasonal growth and death in annual plants. But what's far less familiar to most people is that there's actually three other astronomical cycles that generate climate over much longer periods. And these ones also engender biotic change. So the first of the long-term cycles involves the tilt of the Earth on its axis. So on average, the Earth is tilted about 23.5 degrees, but this actually varies from between 22 degrees to 25 degrees over the course of around 41,000 years. The second cycle involves the shape of the Earth's orbit around the sun. And it's not a perfectly circular orbit, and it actually varies on a cycle of around 100,000 years. And then finally, the third cycle is called the precession of the equinoxes, and it relates to where the Earth is in its orbit around when the solstices and equinoxes occur. So, for example, if the June solstice, where the North Pole is tilted toward the sun and the South Pole is tilted away from the sun, occurs when the Earth is relatively far from the sun, then what you're going to see is that the change in climate from summer to winter will be relatively modest in the northern hemisphere and relatively pronounced in the southern hemisphere. So in other words, the distance of the Earth to the sun can either accentuate or it can lessen the effects of the axial tilt on the weather. And that's depending on whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere. Currently, these factors tend to exacerbate seasonal climate change in the northern hemisphere, but 11,000 years ago, the June solstice occurred when the Earth was relatively close to the sun, and seasonal changes in the weather were more heavily seen in the southern hemisphere, so it kind of alternates. And together, these three cycles generate a quasi-cycle of about 100,000 years. And it's produced about 8 long periods of extensive glaciation, followed by brief, warmer interglacial periods during the past 800,000 years. So you can see here we have an interglacial period where the temperature is a little bit higher, and then you'll have your glacial periods where the mean temperature is low. But when we look at the climate record of just this past 150,000 years, what you see here, there's kind of some pivotal questions that emerge. So a question that's important to ask is, will the current interglacial period that we're in end soon? And will human alteration of the Earth's climate lead us into a super interglacial period? So predicting what the current interglacial period might end is a really daunting task for people, and not many people have attempted that. But predicting the consequences of an increase caused by greenhouse gases has become a major enterprise for scientists. So the concern about global warming and the increase in these greenhouse gases begins with 3 observations. First, we have water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and chlorofluorocarbons, and ozone and even some other gases that are known to allow solar radiation to penetrate the atmosphere and warm the Earth's surface, but to keep it from radiating energy back into space. So this is called the greenhouse effect, and those gases are called greenhouse gases. And I'm going to get a little bit more in depth to the greenhouse effect in just a second. The second concern about global warming and the rise of greenhouse gases is that atmospheric concentrations of many of the major greenhouse gases have been rising. So in particular, atmospheric CO2 concentrations have increased about 30% over pre-industrial levels, and methane concentrations have more than doubled. Third, the mean global temperatures appear to be rising as well, so by about 0.3 to 0.6 degrees Celsius since just 1850. So it's widely believed that our enormous consumption of fossil fuels and our generation of chlorofluorocarbons and the devastation of our ecosystems that actually serve as carbon reservoirs and are responsible for getting rid of some of the carbon for us are responsible for much of the increase in the greenhouse gases that we've seen. And this increase is what's causing global temperatures to rise. So that's kind of the main theory behind global warming. And you can see here there's a pretty obvious trend. Our global temperature here, the black line, has been increasing pretty steadily. Of course, you're going to have peaks and valleys, but it's been increasing. And the carbon dioxide levels have been going up pretty much just right with it. We've also seen an increase in methane and nitrous oxide, as well as other greenhouse gases. But it's kind of a correlation that you can't really ignore. It's something that is pretty obvious that it's happening. So now I want to give you guys a little bit more information on how the greenhouse effect really works. So carbon dioxide, methane, and other trace gases in the atmosphere are all transparent to sunlight. They allow the light energy to pass through the atmosphere and reach the surface of the Earth and warm it. And these gases and water vapor actually also in the form of clouds end up trapping the energy that's coming off of the Earth as heat. So this slows the rate at which heat can leave the Earth's surface and radiate back into space. And these gases are called greenhouse gases because they kind of function a lot like the glass of a greenhouse, right? So in a greenhouse, the glass is transparent to sunlight, but what it does is it traps the energy inside the greenhouse once it's transformed into heat. So the similar warming effect of Earth by its atmospheric gases is called the greenhouse effect. And we can imagine that these gases act kind of like blankets on the Earth's surface. The denser the concentration of gases, the more heat is trapped near the Earth. And the higher the planet's surface temperature is going to become. So the greenhouse effect isn't all bad. It occurs naturally. It's been around for as long as the Earth's atmosphere has been here. It actually is what allows life to flourish on Earth. Without it, the temperature on Earth's surface would fall dramatically and we couldn't survive. But today, as a result of human activity, concentrations of greenhouse gases are increasing so much that scientists believe they're already affecting the Earth's climate. So the term global warming is used to describe this increased temperature that's resulting from the greenhouse effect. And global climate change refers to the complete set of climate characteristics that are changing now and will continue to change in the future, including patterns of like precipitation and wind. So you can see here in this schematic, we have our solar radiation coming down. It's transformed into heat, and the heat gets caught pretty much in the greenhouse gases and clouds as well. And you might think, well, clouds are pretty natural, right? What does that have to do with us? There's clouds normally. But a lot of the clouds that we're creating have to do with the human impacts that we have. So if you think about a lot of our factories releasing steam constantly, a lot of this is increasing the number of the amount of cloud cover that we have and keeping this heat from being able to escape. So it's really insulating the surface of the Earth. So what is causing this increase in greenhouse gases? And During the past 100 years, global levels of CO2, methane, and other trace gases have been steadily increasing. And primarily, it's as a result of burning fossil fuels, so coal, oil, other natural gases. But another factor that impacts this is the clearing of forests during logging and the development of new agricultural land that also contributes to the rising concentrations of CO2. And through these activities, humans are currently releasing about 70 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every day. So the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has actually increased from 290 parts per million to around 415 parts per million over the last 100 years. And it's projected to reach around 580 parts per million at some point in the later half of this century. So it's increasing at a massive scale. Even if plans to reduce CO2 production were implemented tomorrow, they wouldn't have a very immediate reduction. So it's going to take time. So at our present atmospheric CO2 levels, CO2 molecules are going to be in the atmosphere for around 100 years before being removed by plants, natural geochemical processes, etc. And because of this time lag, levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are going to continue to rise for now. So even if we do all these things and we implement strategies to reduce our CO2 emissions, it deters a lot of people because you don't see an immediate effect. It's not going to really affect us as much as it's going to have an effect on the future generations. And a lot of people are unwilling to change their lifestyle for the future generations when it's not going to affect them. Another significant greenhouse gas is methane. So this has increased from around 770 parts per billion to around 1900 parts per billion in the last 100 years. And that's as a result of things like rice cultivation, cattle production. So I think everyone chose the video option for the video literature review. So you would have seen some of how cattle are producing methane in that movie. And it's pretty astounding. But it's also being increased by microbial activity in things like dumps, the burning of tropical forests and grasslands, fossil fuel production. And even though its levels are lower than CO2 in the atmosphere, it's far more efficient at absorbing heat. So even though it's there in a lower concentration, it is an excellent contributor to the greenhouse effect. It is causing a lot of issues. And methane molecules persist in the atmosphere for even longer than CO2. So reduction in methane levels are going to require changes in agricultural practices and improved pollution controls. Climatologists are predicting that the world's climate is going to increase in temperature by an additional 1 to 3 degrees Celsius or 1.8 to 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. And as a result it's really as a result of these increased CO2 levels and other gases. And the increase could actually be even greater. So that's supposedly a modest estimate. And it could be in the range of 3 to 6 degrees Celsius, which is actually 5.4 to 10.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And at the rate we're seeing it, it might end up being on that higher end of the range. It could also be slightly less, but that's if all countries reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases in the very near future, which is something we're not sure if it's going to happen. So carbon dioxide is the most important of Earth's long-lived greenhouse gases. It absorbs less heat per molecule than the greenhouse gases like methane or nitrous oxide, but the reason it's the most important is because it's the most abundant, and it stays in the atmosphere for a really long time. And while carbon dioxide is less abundant and less powerful than water vapor on a molecule per molecule basis, it absorbs wavelengths of thermal energy that water vapor doesn't, which means it actually adds to the greenhouse effect in its own unique way. And what it does is it increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide are actually responsible for about 2/3 of the total energy imbalance that's causing the Earth's temperature to rise. So it's having a massive impact. Natural increases in carbon dioxide concentrations have periodically warmed the Earth's temperature. So during ice age cycles over the past million years or more, there were warm episodes like the interglacial cycles. And they began with a small increase in sunlight due to the tiny wobble in the Earth's axis of rotation. And that little bit of extra sunlight caused a little bit of warming. And as the oceans warmed, they actually outgassed carbon dioxide. So think of it like a can of soda going flat in the heat of a summer day. So that's what they were doing. The carbon dioxide was bubbling up and going into the atmosphere, and that amplified the initial warming. So this is all natural occurrence, right? This has to do with the factors that we talked about with the Earth's rotation. So based on air bubbles that were trapped in mile-thick ice cores and other paleoclimate evidence, we know that during the ice age cycles of the past million years or so, carbon dioxide never exceeded 300 parts per million in the atmosphere. Before the Industrial Revolution started in the mid 1700s, the global average amount of carbon dioxide was about 280 parts per million. Right now, our atmospheric CO2 level is about 415 parts per million, which is actually up from the average in 2019 that you see in this graph, which is 409.8 parts per million. So it's increasing every year, and it's way higher than we have ever seen. So if global energy demand continues to grow and to be met mostly with fossil fuels, atmospheric carbon dioxide is projected to exceed 900 parts per million by the end of the century. So you can see it just shot right up recently. We went from quite low, actually, less than 200 parts per million to 415 now. In the last 170 years, we've actually seen a dramatic switch in the average global temperature as well. So you can see here, before the 1940s, the temperature was actually usually around a ½ degree cooler than the historical compared average. But since 1940, we've started to see a shift, and it's gotten worse and worse. And the increase in temperature will be the greatest at the high latitudes and over large continents, which of course is where all of the ice is that we don't want to melt. That's where we're seeing it the most. But I mean, it's pretty obvious when you look here at the trend that the temperature, the anomalies in the average temperature were always less than average until we got to recent history, when we all of a sudden now have greater than average annual temperatures. So it's a pretty obvious effect. So there's a lot of secondary effects to climate change. It's not just about the weather getting warmer, right? It's not about the climate just getting slightly warmer. There's a lot more happening because of that change. So rainfall has already started to increase on a global scale, and it's going to continue to increase, but will vary by region. So some regions are going to show decreases in rainfall. Some are going to show extreme increases, but it's going to pull us away from the norm that those regions have seen. We've also seen an increase in extreme weather events like hurricanes, flooding, snowstorms, regional drought, and all of this is associated with this warming that we're seeing. In dry forests and savannas, warmer conditions are resulting in increased incidence of fire. In coastal areas, storms will cause increased destruction of cities and other human settlements and are going to severely damage coastal vegetation, including beaches and coral reefs. And computer simulation models of future weather patterns are rapidly improving to include more variables. So, for example, the role of the ocean in absorbing atmospheric CO2, how plant communities will respond to higher CO2 levels and temperatures, the effects of increased levels of anthropogenic aerosols, so airborne particles resulting from burning fossil fuels and wood and other sources, and even the role of cloud cover in reflecting sunlight. So we're going to get into some of these things in a little bit more detail, but in our next lecture, we're actually going to talk about the specifics that we're seeing within the oceans and the forests, and the specific causes happening with agriculture. So I'm not going to cover it all in this lecture, but I am going to cover some of it, and then we're going to get into details next time. So another thing that we've been seeing is the range shifts of animals. So the easiest way for a species to adapt to climate change is to shift its geographic range to a new area that has the appropriate climate that they're looking for. And the simplest response would just be moving towards the poles. So during warmer periods, they'll move towards the poles. During colder periods, they'll move towards the equator. But right now, what we're seeing is everything moving towards the poles. Sometimes in mountainous areas, the range shifts can be much shorter, so they could just go up the mountain instead, and that way they can get to the colder regions. Because actually moving about 100 meters up in elevation is equivalent to moving about 110 kilometers in latitude in terms of temperature. And so we're seeing this trend right now where some plant and animal species are changing their ranges. They're even changing the timing of their reproductive behavior in response to the temperature changes. So evidence indicates that the ocean surface water temperature has also changed over the last 40 years, and the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Oceans have increased in temperatures by about 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade. And as a consequence, even marine creatures are expanding their range. They're going to higher latitudes, so they're going to the poles. And we're seeing this in marine creatures, we're seeing this in many birds. So like the wood thrush and the common loon that we see here, their range has shifted very dramatically. And it's because they are no longer able to find the suitable climate that they're looking for in their previous range. So they're having to go more and more north. And it's really not hard to envision whole sets of species shifting across the globe in response to climate change, but it's a bit too simplistic to think of it that way. So if we look beyond the distribution of communities and we examine the past distributions of individual species, a more complex pattern emerges. In general, most species have responded to climate change individually. So they're not in lockstep with other species. They're not all going at the same time. For example, two species that co-occur widely today are the American beech and the eastern hemlock. 12,000 years ago, they didn't overlap. So the climate was different, but as the climate changed and the ice shelves retreated, their ranges began to overlap. And now this can end up being kind of an issue because similar species may need to share resources, and it could evidently lead to increased competition and a reduction in the population of one or more of these species. So we're seeing species moving at different rates and to different areas, and typically we weren't seeing it on such a large scale, but now what we're seeing is it's kind of happening with pretty much anything that relies on a certain climate. A lot of things are shifting right now. So it's on a much larger scale than we've seen in the previous climate change history. But global climate change isn't a new phenomenon, right? I told you guys how it goes on cycles, right? We go into our glacial periods and our interglacial periods, and during the past 2 million years, there's been at least 10 cycles of global warming and cooling. So when the polar ice caps melted during the warm periods, the sea levels even rose, and they were well above their earlier levels. Species ended up extending their range closer to the poles. They migrated to higher elevations on mountains. During cold periods, the ice caps enlarged and the sea levels dropped, and the species shifted their range closer to the equator to lower elevations. And while many species undoubtedly would go extinct during these repeated episodes of range changes, the species we have today are actually survivors of global climate change. So if a species could adjust to changes in global climate in the past, the question is, will species be able to adjust to the predicted changes in the global climate that is being caused by humans right now? And with everything that we've been seeing, it seems unlikely. Most species are not going to be able to survive human climate change in the future. So our actions are really speeding up the process which this occurs much more rapidly than previous climate shifts. Um, Many species will be unable to disperse rapidly enough to track the changing climate. Habitat fragmentation caused by human activities is even going to slow it further. It's going to prevent a lot of species from being able to migrate to new sites where suitable habitat exists. Many species of limited distribution or poor dispersal qualities, like snakes, amphibians, forest birds, small insects, spiders, they're undoubtedly going to go extinct. With There's widely distributed, easily dispersed species that are going to be favored in new communities. Extinction rates for species of restricted ranges could be 9 to 13%. So that's over 1 million species that are predicted to have gone extinct in the next 50 years. And this is much higher than the natural extinction rate. So a lot of this is being caused by the inability of them to migrate to areas that are suitable habitats for them. So entire biological communities might become altered or degraded if the dominant species aren't able to adapt to changing conditions. So you could just think, if a keystone species of an area is one of these species that can't move enough, it's going to cause the complete degradation of that ecosystem. And as a result of global climate change, climatic regions in the northern and southern temperate zones are actually being shifted to the poles. So this change has already begun, with alpine plants found they're growing higher on mountains now. Migrating birds are spending longer times in their summer breeding grounds. In the coming century, global climate change is predicted to have a great impact on Arctic and boreal and alpine ecosystems. So that's a result of warmer conditions and a longer growing season. And all of our climate models are predicting that the greatest warming is going to take place in the polar regions. So polar ice caps, sea ice, they're already melting at alarming rates. And this can be an issue because the species that live in the northmost areas and relied on cold temperatures really have nowhere to go to find a colder climate. Parts of Arctic regions are becoming more and more like temperate regions, and eventually we might lose all of our Arctic biomes. So you can see here the loss of our ice over time, and this is just in like 40 years. So 1985 to 2018, you can see this loss that we've had in the ice in the north. You can see these poor walruses having to really congregate together on such a small ice shelf. We know polar bears are also having issues because they're unable to go out and hunt. There's not enough ice for them to go out and find food on. And they're actually coming closer and closer to people and becoming an issue with people. We've seen range shifts, right, in the polar bears and grizzly bears, and that's what created growler bears. So two species that had never previously overlapped are now breeding with each other because their habitats, their ranges are overlapping. So it's not even just the polar regions, right? So the effects on global climate change on temperature and rainfall are actually also expected to have dramatic effects on tropical ecosystems. Many species and biological communities appear to have narrow tolerances for temperature and rainfall. So when we talked about our biomes, remember we talked about how temperature and rainfall are the two factors that really determine what biome you're going to have. So even small changes in these could have major impacts on the species composition. Cycles of plant reproduction can be affected, patterns of migration, susceptibility to fire. Major decreases in the area of rainforests are very likely in the future with all of this happening. So, given that the Earth's current biota has experienced and survived many of these glacial or interglacial cycles during the past 800,000 years, most species appear to be quite well adapted to climate change. So obviously, this adaptability is good news if we're entering a period of significant climate flux, but the bad news is that many of these species may not be able to adapt to another climate change as readily as they have to past changes. And that's for two closely related reasons. First, current populations of many species are already stressed by habitat degradation and loss. So, they've also been stressed by overexploitation and by other factors. And we went through a lot of the human impacts. All of these things are stressing these individuals already. So now adding climate change and their need to shift areas is just adding on so much pressure. Stressed populations are likely to be small. And we've talked about how small populations have a lower chance of surviving. So they have a relatively low chance of producing the offspring that they need to be able to disperse. And the second reason that these animals are not going to be able to deal with these changes as readily is because human alteration of landscapes has reduced the total amount of suitable habitat for many species. And for others, it's fragmented landscapes with roads, agricultural fields, urban areas, and the odds of an individual being able to disperse and to be able to find a suitable habitat has been reduced. So it doesn't matter whether it's like a willow seed that's carried in the wind or a juvenile salamander that's walking along the forest floor. A lot of these individuals that are trying to disperse are going to perish because the long distances of in-hospital environments between their patches and suitable habitat have become so great. So it's also possible that global temperatures might increase to the levels greater than anything that most species have experienced yet. So this is going to require longer range shifts, and some species might encounter something called a geographic bottleneck. So we talked about bottlenecks, genetic bottlenecks. Well, the same thing can kind of happen geographically. Imagine a terrestrial species that's living south of the equator in Africa. Or even South America. So if you're living sort of in this larger area of Africa, if they shift their ranges towards the South Pole, which if you're south of the equator, that would be the shortest distance to go. You'd want to go south to get to the cold, to get to cooler areas. They're going to encounter a gradually tapering continent like this. And eventually it's going to end at the ocean. They can only go so far. And as they get lower down here, they're going to be more crowded, right? They're going to have less room for these species to live, more competition. And a lot of species are going to be outcompeted and will go extinct. A different kind of geographic bottleneck is likely to occur along ocean shorelines because warmer temperatures would melt a portion of the polar ice caps, causing the sea level to rise. In many regions, shoreline species that need to move inland would find themselves kind of squeezed between the ocean and an intensive shorefront development. We know that as humans, we often build a lot of our major cities near shores, and that's because they're ports, right, for importing goods. And there's a ton of resources that we can get from the ocean. So a lot of our major cities, you can see even in Africa, when you look at the cities, a lot of them border the ocean. So these species that live near the ocean are going to be kind of pinched between our cities and our development and the rising sea level and the loss of habitat that they're getting. So similarly, although species living in mountainous areas can move their ranges up the mountains, mountains get smaller as you get to the top, and eventually they stop. So this phenomenon might be indirectly responsible for the extinction of the golden toad, which we talked about previously in the class, and also the disappearance of 20 other frog species from Monteverde, where the golden toad is from. You might remember we talked about him in our extinction lecture, and we talked about how climate change was probably a major factor in their extinction. Warmer ocean temperatures appear to have led to a sharp decrease in the number of misty days during the dry season, and this forced some of these frog species to kind of congregate along streams where they were more vulnerable to parasites. Some bird species at Monteverde have apparently responded to climate change by shifting their range upward, but the site only reaches about 1,800 meters in elevation, so it kind of limits their opportunity for going upward. And as the climate changes, they're not going to be able to compensate anymore. And there's a ton of evidence that this is happening on a massive scale. So a survey of published information on temperature-dependent biological phenomena, so for example, like early flowering dates for plants, first calling dates for frogs, all of these things have been documented for many years. And they did a study looking at all of these, and from 143 long-term studies that they conducted around the world, it revealed that more than 80% of species are shifting their ranges because of the influence of global warming. And in fact, across a wide variety of organisms, from trees to insects, the timing of important biological events actually moved ahead on average by 5 days per decade over the last century. So it's shifting everything. It's shifting their ranges. It's shifting their behaviors and their timing. There have also been some effects of global warming that people don't typically think of. So for example, many reptile and fish species are significantly impacted by global warming because of the temperature that the eggs incubate at. So for a lot of these species, the temperature determines the sex of the offspring. So this is called temperature-dependent sex determination. And in this graph, you can see that the temperature and the level of determination actually varies by species. So here it shows the American alligator and the red-eared slider and the alligator snapping turtle. And if you remember from one of our previous lectures, extreme differences in the sex ratio of a population decrease its effective population size drastically. So to combat this, some species have had to nest earlier, and they actually have been seen going to new areas and having to search longer for suitable sites to lay their eggs that might allow for cooler temperatures during incubation, so like shady spots. So all of this is changing their sex ratios and changing their populations, and they're having to come up with new ways to combat this. So it's something that a lot of people don't think about. It's not one of the main impacts of global warming that is advertised. So plants are also pretty widely affected by climate change. They're already responding to climate change, as we can see by their earlier flowering and leaving times in the spring. In coming decades, some plant species will adapt to utilize the increased CO2 levels and higher temperatures to increase their growth rates, whereas other less adaptable species won't be able to, and they're going to decrease in abundance or maybe even go extinct. So vegetation patterns and the production of plant biomass are also going to change, but not in a consistent pattern, because it all depends on what the plant is adapted for. So we see increased tree mortality, and it's already occurring in some ecosystems, and it's going to continue to occur in coming decades because of water stress. So for example, in Arctic areas, the permafrost, which is a layer of soil that continuously stays frozen, is melting for the first time in thousands of years. And trees that rely on this frost to keep them upright are simply falling over in the waterlogged ground. It's also causing more avalanches because the ground is becoming less and less stable, so it's decreasing habitats as well. And Many areas of rainforest in the Amazon and elsewhere are going to change into savannas because of shifts in precipitation. Also shifts in the populations of herbivores, insect species, pollinators. They're all going to be seen a lot as their plant resources change. So it's kind of a chain of events that's happening here. So we're seeing impacts on the plants, we're seeing impacts on the species that rely on the plants. So it's really another one of those trophic cascades that we're seeing where it's all kind of trickling. And it's going to have an impact on us as well. So a lot of convincing people to care about climate change is coming up with or telling them about reasons that they are specifically going to be impacted. And it's a shame that we have to come up with reasons that specifically impact people for them to care, but it is what it is. And one of the ways that it is going to impact us is the large areas where our temperate agricultural crops like wheat and corn and soybeans are now, they're showing yields declining by 30% or more and by the end of the century. So that's because we're having higher temperatures and changing rainfall patterns. And farm areas may have to be moved farther from the equator and perhaps even expanded in size just to maintain their production levels. So we're losing a lot of our crops and our food because they just simply can't survive in the regions they're in. They are staying stable while the climate is causing the biomes to shift. So many of these areas are potentially suitable for us to move our agriculture are actually currently protected conservation land areas like national parks. So this is going to increase the competition that we already have between supplying the food needs for people and protecting biodiversity. So there's already a big debate of, if it's going to help people, is it worth it to just get rid of these national parks? But this is going to make it even worse because now we're going to have to shift our agriculture. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to grow the same crops there. So because of the implications of global climate change and because they're so far-reaching, biological communities, ecosystem functions, and climate need to be carefully monitored over the coming decades. Global climate change is going to have an enormous impact on the human populations in coastal areas affected by rising sea levels. And if species are in danger of going extinct in the wild because of global climate change, the last remaining individuals might have to be maintained in captivity. Another strategy that we're going to need to consider is transplanting isolated populations of rare and endangered species to new areas. So it might involve taking a species that's not doing well and putting it at a higher elevation and creating a new population, or maybe putting it closer to the poles where they can survive and they can thrive. And this is especially important for species that are unable to migrate on their own. So this idea of taking species and implanting them in new places where they might be able to survive better is called assisted colonization. And there's considerable debate within the conservation community about whether assisted colonization really represents a valid strategy. A lot of people believe that it's too problematic because it increases the potential of transplanted species to become invasive in their new ranges. We don't know how they're going to interact necessarily with these new places we're bringing them, and they may cause more harm than good. So when we're considering what to protect, it's important to take into account all of the changes that we're seeing and to weigh the costs and benefits of everything. So we can use an example in this picture that I have here as a model. We have a rare butterfly species that lives in a protected area. This is current, right? And in 100 years, the climate changed, right? So the butterflies needed to migrate. They migrated to a higher elevation. Now our protected area does not include our endangered butterfly species anymore. So it's important that when we're coming up with ways to protect these species, we're taking into account the future. And we're coming up with plans that are going to protect these species now and in the future, even if it takes a little bit more effort right now. So a better plan would be to protect the range that they're currently in and the range that they're projected to be in the future. But unfortunately, it doesn't provide a plan for those animals that don't have anywhere else to go, right? So the ones that were initially at the top of the mountain can no longer be there, right? Because now the bottom of the mountain, that climate, is what you're seeing at the top of the mountain. The top of the mountain climate is gone. They have nowhere to go. So we don't really have ways to protect them, and that's where the assisted colonization comes in, where we would take these species and put them somewhere else where they would be able to survive. So whether or not that will work or whether it's worth it is still of debate. So we'll see how that all goes. So there's a lot of controversy over whether or not people have an effect on global warming. Some people are adamant that it is not a human-caused occurrence, that it's a natural occurrence, and we have nothing to do with the increased rate. However, in the scientific community, there's an overwhelming consensus that global warming is in fact real, and we are the main cause of its increased rate. So most of the controversy actually comes from the non-scientific community. But one major issue that we see is the difference in language between the science community and the public. And this is something that's been a really big deal recently also with COVID and the COVID vaccine. I've seen a lot of debate on, well, they said, the scientists said it might do this or it might do that. But when scientists use words like it's unknown or it might do this or maybe, they're actually completely normal terms. And every single study is going to have these types of words. They don't mean that the scientist is uncertain about what they're talking about. Almost no scientist is going to speak in certainties because in science, nothing's really certain, right? That's why when a scientist disagrees with someone, they're often going to say things like, well, there's no evidence to support that. And that's pretty much, that means the scientist is positive that what you just said is false. And as the general public, people are more likely to say things like, no, it's not true, or this is a fact, I know this, because they're not thinking like a scientist. Scientists know that nothing can be completely proven. So they're not going to claim that something's a fact. Instead, they'll use terms like, the evidence suggests this. And unfortunately, the general public often sees those terms as being a version of uncertainty. When it really isn't. It's pretty much as certain as you can get in the scientific community. So we can see this with climate change very clearly. In fact, if you look at data, only 1 in 4 Americans believe that there is a scientific consensus about climate change, when in fact, 97% of scientists are in agreement about climate change. So there's kind of this lack of communication, and where people are not truly understanding the terminology that scientists use when they speak to people. So some skeptics are also argue that humans aren't influential enough to change the atmosphere on a large scale. But what's interesting is actually we were able to sort of disprove this, because one event in history where following 9/11, air traffic ceased for 3 days. So there was no air traffic for 3 days straight. And due to the lack of the insulating effect from the jet exhaust, we actually saw the average nighttime temperature drop by 1 degree Celsius in just those couple of days. And then the air traffic began again, and we suddenly saw the temperature increase back to what it was. So just from a couple of days of reducing our fossil fuel emission by such a drastic amount, we saw an immediate decrease in the temperature. And another unfortunate statistic is that the United States is one of the leading countries in climate change skepticism. In fact, at least 40% of Americans don't believe in human-caused climate change at all. Even people that believe in climate change don't all believe that it's something that we have to deal with right now. In fact, Yale had a poll that they did where it actually showed that 65% of people believe that climate change is going to harm future generations, but only 38% of them think that they could be directly affected by climate change today. So a lot of the controversy that comes out is whether or not we need to worry right now, or if we need to make sacrifices when it's not actually hurting us directly, or it might not be, according to some people. But we shouldn't, in my opinion, have to have a direct impact on us to care about our future, right? About future generations and about the animals that are on Earth. Because if we don't do something right now, our future generations aren't going to have a chance, right? They're not going to be able to fix it then. We can't just hold it off and wait. It has to do with starting now. And there's a lot of evidence that global climate change is in fact real, that it is caused by humans, and that even though, yes, there is natural climate change, we are increasing this by a massive rate. So even with all of this skepticism, there's still an overwhelming amount of evidence that human-caused global warming is real. And we talked about all of these in lecture, but just to summarize them here, we have increased temperatures and incidence of heat. So thermometer records kept over the past century and a half show that the Earth's average temperature has risen more than 1 degree Fahrenheit and about twice that in the Arctic. Also, the top 10 warmest years in history all occurred since 2005. And actually, if we get rid of number 10, it's all since 2010. So in the last 11 years, we have had 9 of the top 10 warmest years in history. And that's something that you can't deny. It's pretty obvious. We also have a correlation with the increase of CO2 and our temperature increases. So we're seeing, you saw on our graph earlier, that as CO2 increases, so does the global temperature. And even though people might think, well, it's 1 degree, what does it matter? 1 degree is quite a lot in the scheme of the entire Earth, because you're looking at the Earth average, and it can cause a lot. 1 degree is kind of the difference between whether or not our ice shelves are going to melt. So it's a big deal. Also, we are seeing our melting of glaciers and polar ice. So Arctic sea summer ice has been declining by around 11% in area every decade since the 1970s. Another example is of the 150 glaciers that are found in Glacier National Park in Montana. In 1850, there were 150 large glaciers. Now only 25 of them are still larger than 25 acres. So they've almost all decreased. We also have rising sea levels. So the rate of sea level rise since the mid-19th century has been faster than during the previous 2 millennia. We're seeing earlier spring activity. So spring now arrives more than 10 days earlier in the northern hemisphere than it did in the 1950s. Plants are also flowering earlier than they ever have in recorded history. We're seeing shifts in species ranges. So the ranges of spiders and beetles and butterflies, grasshoppers, they've all shifted northward by more than 50 kilometers over the past 25 years in the United Kingdom. So that's 30 miles. And on average, worldwide species ranges are shifting around 17 kilometers closer to the pole every decade. And finally, we've also seen a ton of population declines. So, for example, climate change has been implicated in the extinction of populations of desert bighorn sheep and checker spot butterflies and the golden toad, etc. The list goes on and on and on. There's a ton of them. So all of these things, we're seeing them. They're all evidence that global warming is happening, and it's happening at an increased rate than what it should be happening. And I went over a lot of the different things that it's causing today. In the lecture tomorrow, I'm going to talk about a lot more of it, especially the impacts that it's having on the ocean. So we're going to talk about ocean acidification and a little bit more about the rising sea levels and the increase in the temperature. So that'll come tomorrow. We're also going to talk about some stuff in the forest habitats tomorrow, and some of the causes, some of the issues that agriculture is causing right now. So I will have your next 2 lectures uploaded at some point tomorrow, and enjoy the rest of your week.